Today, I'm joined by lawyer and author Alan Dershowitz to go through some of the biggest stories in the legal news. Alan, thank you for joining me again.
Always a pleasure to be on your show. You're so smart and you ask such good questions.
Oh, I appreciate that. Here's one for you. President Trump froze $2.3 billion in federal funding to Harvard for failing to drop DEI hiring practices, DEI admission practices, and stop anti-Semitism on campus. Harvard's president, Alan Garber, called the demands unconstitutional, asserting that the university's independence and First Amendment rights are being violated. What are your thoughts on Trump's actions and Harvard's president's reaction?
I just want everybody to imagine what would have happened in 1956 and 57 when I was in college, and some universities in the South were allowing harassment of Black students, were teaching white supremacy in the courtroom, and were just making it very uncomfortable for African Americans. Imagine if the federal government came in and said, look, we're not going to give you federal funding unless you end the harassment of Black students, unless you stop teaching white supremacy. Everybody today who is against what is being done to Harvard would be in favor of that. They'd be saying, wow, that's wonderful. That's the way you use federal funding to make sure that there's no discrimination against Blacks and no teaching of white supremacy. So now, flash forward 70 years, and what do we have? Discrimination against Jews, harassment of Jews, and teaching essentially the rough equivalent of white supremacy against Israel, against Jews, against Christians, totally one-sided teaching. So if the shoe were on the other foot, I think many people would be taking a very, very different view of this. My view is that what Trump has done is overbroad, but generally correct. He shouldn't be cutting out any funding of medical research, cancer research, research about child illnesses and diseases, but he should be cutting out all federal funding of ideological programs. For example, you have the Carr Center at Harvard University, which purports to be a human rights center. It's not. It's just anti-Israel, anti-American, anti-Christian. I know because I've lectured there and I've been prohibited from lecturing there. By the way, I taught at Harvard for 50 years, probably the most popular professor there. I cannot speak at Harvard today. I cannot make a speech. I cannot talk pro-Israel. I've been canceled by Harvard. They don't want my point of view to be heard. There's enough from the point of view of the anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Trump attitudes. They don't need my point of view. So what Trump is doing is right in intention and probably overbroad. And I think there'll be negotiations. And in the end, probably it will come out right. We'll see at the end of federal funding for ideology, but a continuation of federal funding for pure science.
Okay. I wrote that question early this morning, and then about an hour ago, I amended that because I saw that former President Barak Obama broke his silence on this story. He said, Harvard set an example for other institutions by rejecting an unlawful and ham-handed attempt to stifle academic freedom while fostering an environment of intellectual inquiry and mutual respect. Former President Obama then encouraged other universities to reject Trump and fight against his demands. Trump responded by saying he might block even more money to Harvard and remove their tax-exempt status. Your thoughts on the two presidents going back and forth?
Well, first of all, Barack Obama is a complete and total hypocrite. If the issue were cutting off funding to racist, segregationist, white supremacists, he'd be completely in favor of it. He would forget about the First Amendment. He'd forget about independence, academic freedom. He's not a principled person. He just looks for results. He's part of the problem, not part of the solution. When he was at Harvard, he was completely in favor of all the negative things that Harvard is doing, race-based admission, DEA, all of those programs, denial of due process, many of those things. And so don't listen to Barack Obama. Don't listen to Bernie Sanders, made similar statements recently. Again, these are folks that just, it's due process for me, but not for thee. rights for me, but not for thee. Listen to people who care about rights in a neutral way. There aren't too many of them, but those are the ones you should listen to.
Okay. Dennis Prager has said something similar about his alma mater, Columbia, where he's saying, I would now not send my children to Columbia. They've become too woke, too anti-Semitic. Is this a common theme with all universities or mostly among Ivy League universities?
It's mostly Ivy League and elite universities. It's not true at the University of Florida. It's not true at Duke University. It's not true at Vanderbilt. There are many universities which have really confronted these issues, but it's very true at Columbia. I grew up with Dennis and his brother. We grew up in the same neighborhood, same background. I didn't get into Columbia. He did. I went to Brooklyn College. Same things happened at Brooklyn College. I can't speak at Brooklyn College. I'm probably the most well-known graduate of Brooklyn College. They won't invite me back to speak about Israel because I'm not in favor of divestment from Israel. If I wanted to speak in favor of divestment from Israel, they'd welcome me back with open arms. So universities today have become closed-minded propaganda mills in many instances. That's why so many students are taking business, taking technology, STEM. They're staying away from history, political science, philosophy, because they know they're not getting history, political science, and philosophy. They're getting propaganda. Look, I taught at Harvard for 50 years, 10,000 students. Never once in the 50 years did I ever express a personal view or a political view in my classroom. Never. I would make arguments against my own views to be the devil's advocate, to teach students how to think. For example, I'm a strong opponent of the death penalty. But in my class, I would favor the death penalty. I would make the students defeat me in argument on the death penalty, because my job is not to persuade students what to think. It's to teach them how to think better. And that's not what universities are doing today. So I favor pressure on Harvard. I favor pressure on Columbia. I think it's been overdone by being over-inclusive and going after research projects, but I think that will work out in the end once we have negotiation. Let's remember what Harvard did. Very smart, very clever, very shrewd. What they did is the president made a strong announcement saying, we're not going to do anything. We're not giving in. We're going to fight back. And then he hires two lawyers to represent Harvard, both of whom are close to Trump, and sending a message, don't worry about what we're saying publicly. In private, we'll negotiate, we'll compromise, and we'll come to a deal, which, of course, is what Trump always wants to do, come to a deal. So I think both sides are going to negotiate, and in the end, there'll be a compromise.
Okay, interesting. I appreciate that perspective. What is your thoughts on these lower judges that continue to try to block President Trump? Is this about obstructing a president they don't politically or ideologically have similar beliefs, or is this their honest interpretation of the law through their lens, and they genuinely believe President Trump is wrong?
A little of both. A little of both. I think consciously they think they're just following their role as Article 3 judges under the Constitution, but unconsciously we know that they would come to different conclusions if it was the Obama administration. And so I think we're seeing politics having its thumb on the scale of justice. The one thing I think we need reform, and we'll get reform. I think Congress will reform this. Even Democrats will agree with this. You can't have a single judge in Boise, Idaho, rendering a decision that binds the entire United States. There's going to have to be a court like the FISA court, a national court that you have to go to if you want to get an injunction that covers the entire country. And so I think we're going to see a movement in that direction. Judges clearly are overreaching, but they often have throughout history. They tried to stop the New Deal in the 1930s, and we have the famous court packing plan by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that caused what people call the switch in time that saved nine. So we've seen this conflict between the executive branch and the judicial branch over and over again, starting with Thomas Jefferson. It's not a constitutional crisis. It's a constitutional conflict. It would become a crisis if the Supreme Court ordered the president to do something directly, unambiguously. And he said the way President Jackson said about Native Americans, to Chief Justice Marshall, you render the decision, now you go enforce it. We haven't seen that. So we're not in a crisis. We're in a conflict, and our system of checks and balances are capable of adjusting and dealing with that.
Okay. I want to read a little bit of a long quote from House Speaker Mike Johnson. This was on Fox News. He said, "We've had a real abuse of this system where these judges will issue nationwide injunction to stop President Trump's agenda. It's been abused. The statistics show it. Remember, 67% of all national injunctions in the last 100 years have only been against President Trump. And 92% of those were issued by Democrat-appointed judges from the bench." I think he's on. He's got his facts about the 67% of injunctions in the last 100 years have been against Trump, 92% Democrat. But this idea of abuse of power, is this a top Republican that likes Donald Trump sharing an opinion, or do you think that there is some truth to his comment? Look, I don't know your exact situation, but if you're like the thousands of homeowners, American Finance can help you. You're struggling to keep your head above water. You're barely making ends meet. You're drowning in high interest rate credit cards and debt. It's not your fault. Life got more expensive. Inflation hit everyone hard. But if you're carrying credit card balances with over 20% interest and you have a mortgage that sits untouched, you're ignoring what could be the thing that turns it all around for you, your home equity. And this is where American Financing can help. Would you trade 10 minutes for a shot at saving on average $800 a month? That's $10,000 a year, because that's exactly what homeowners are doing when they call American Financing. A simple, no obligation call could change everything. They have a team of salary-based mortgage consultants, so there isn't any incentive to put you into a loan that doesn't make sense. Plus, there's no upfront fees to find out how much they can save you. Call them right now at 888-686-8030. Again, that's 888-686-8030. Or visit americanfinancing.net/Gardner. Stop paying high interest. Use your house as a tool. Save money today.
Well, there's some truth to his comment, but it's not a complete truth, because one of the reasons we have so many judicial decisions against Trump is that Trump has tried to push the envelope further than any president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so when you get a president who pushes executive authority as hard as Trump has done, you're going to get judicial reaction to it. So there is some truth to what Speaker Johnson said, but the complete truth requires also that you look at how the executive has provoked judicial responses. So there is some truth to it, but not a complete.
Okay. To be fair, would it also could I also say he's getting more pushback because he's also pushed more executive orders than any president in the last 100 years?
You get an A+ from the law professor for that statement. Of course, you're absolutely right. You have to look at both sides. And he has issued many, many executive orders. By the way, so did Thomas Jefferson. As soon as he came into office, hey, this Louisiana thing, that looks pretty good. Not as good as Denmark, not as good as Greenland, but hey, I'm going to buy Louisiana. Should I get congressional approval? Nah, I don't really need that. Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Do I need congressional approval? Nah, I don't think I'm going to do that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I'm going to put 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent in camps. Do I need congressional approval? Nah, I'm just going to do that. So we've seen throughout history some of our great presidents, obviously, push executive authority as far as it can, and often there's pushback from the court. I've written a lot about that in my writings over the years. And again, they're not constitutional crises. They're conflicts that the framers of the Constitution wrote our system of checks and balances to help deal with. And it's been, 200 and almost 40 years now, and the Constitution has endured fairly well.
Yeah, and I believe it will continue to endure. Okay, you've been for Trump in certain instances. You've been against him. You've represented him during his impeachment, so you know him better than a lot of people. Is President Trump trolling the media and Democrats when he says there's people that want me to run for a third term, or is he being genuine, or what are your thoughts? Because he's sure getting people agitated.
Well, he'd sure like to run for a third term, and I think he's going to abide by the law, and the law won't let him do it. There's only one conceivable way of kind of evading the constitutional amendment that permits only 2 terms. And it's not going to happen, but I'll spell it out for you just as a law school hypothetical. He can't run for vice president because you have to be qualified to be president to run for vice president. But what if he got himself appointed Speaker of the House, or he got himself appointed Secretary of State to the next president, and then persuades the next president? And by the way, in order to be Speaker of the House or in order to be Secretary of State, you don't have to be qualified to be president. And then under the Presidential Succession Act, the people above him all resign, and he then becomes the president as Speaker of the House or Secretary of State. Then you'd have a court decision as to whether or not the amendment to the Constitution that prohibits more than 2 terms is limited to election to more than 2 terms or serving more than 2 terms. And I think, A, it's not going to happen, and B, the American public wouldn't stand for it. I don't think he'd have enough votes. There'd be enough people saying, we love you, Donald Trump. We'd vote for you for a second term, but we're not going to allow you to evade the constitutional restrictions. So I think it's an interesting law school hypothetical, but it's not going to happen.
Okay. I mean, he had his President Grover Cleveland moment of being president, taking a break, making a comeback, but to go for a third time might just be breaking the norms a little too much. But on Twitter, I saw that Steve Bannon, who used to be a top consultant, now he's a podcaster, but still has the ear of the president. He was telling comedian Bill Maher on HBO, President Trump is going to run and he is going to win. Again, is this trolling, or do you think Steve Bannon thinks that he can convince Trump to take that Speaker of the House position or that Secretary of State position?
Oh, I think he believes it, and I think he wants it to happen. It's not going to happen. First of all, he'd be 92 years old at the end of his third term, or something like that. Now, I'm 86, and I think I am perfectly qualified to serve in any office because I feel energetic and young. But 92 years old, I don't know if the American public would really buy into that. Of course, it would depend on who ran against him. Look, the last election, he ran against probably the weakest candidate since Mike Dukakis. And that, didn't help the Democrats or hurt the Republicans. So you never know how to predict the outcome of an election until you know who's running and you know their ages and their health. I mean, thank God Trump's health seems to be fantastic for, 78, 79 years old. And no president has ever been as energetic in the first couple of months in office. The guy is on television every day. He's in the Oval Office holding press conferences. He's answering questions. He's arguing with Zelensky. He's arguing with Netanyahu. He is really showing himself as the Energizer Bunny.
Yeah, I know. I keep thinking, where's he getting all that energy? I saw an AI created little video, and it shows Trump secretly pull out a bottle of pills, and he does it, and then on the front of it is the McDonald's logo. He's somehow getting energy from McDonald's. It was kind of funny. But okay, so I want to talk to you about this. This is big in the news right now. Trump's team removed a migrant and deported him to El Salvador. Now this man has people here in the United States advocating, saying the Trump administration messed up. He shouldn't have been deported. He deserves his day in court. But Trump's team is saying, no, we can connect the dots to the MS-13 gang, which is a terrorist organization. Now you have President Bukele of El Salvador saying, I don't care what Trump or the Supreme Court of America says. We're a sovereign country. He's an El Salvadorian. He's not going back to America. Your thoughts on this legal battle?
Well, I think a lot of people have missed the point about why he should not have been deported. It's not because he wasn't deportable. He was deportable. he's an illegal alien. He doesn't have papers. He is not entitled to be in the United States. But he made an application to stay in the United States on humanitarian grounds because he was afraid that gangs would get him in Salvador. And an immigration judge put a stay on his deportation, allowing him to have his day not in court, not in front of a regular court, but in front of an immigration court. And so, the solution to the problem would be simple if people of goodwill just wanted to see it solved. They would bring him back to the United States. He'd stay there for 72 hours. He'd have a hearing on whether or not he's subject to remaining in the United States on humanitarian grounds. He'd probably lose on that, and then he'd be sent back. I have no doubt that if President Trump called the president of El Salvador and said, "Do me a solid, bring him back, let him come back, we'll send a plane for him," that would happen. I think a lot of people are standing on principle, but he's deportable. And in the end, after due process has been satisfied, the United States Supreme Court will rule that he's subject to deportation. Indeed, I'll give you my prediction generally how the court will rule in all of these cases. It will make a sharp distinction between the power of the executive to decide who stays and who goes, and it will give that power to the president. Yes, you have the power to decide which people stay, which people go, as long as they're not U.S. citizens. But you have to do it right. You have to do it with due process. So we may intrude on procedures, but we're not going to intrude on the substance of all this. So that's the way it's going to come down in the end. And I would hope that the best resolution of this particular case would be to have him sent back to the United States, have him have his hearing, and have him then deported because he's not a legal alien in the United States.
Okay. I've seen both sides of this Judge Boasberg situation where people are saying, no, these gang members that were shipped off to El Salvador, they should each come back to the United States and have their day in court individually, not as a group labeled terrorists or gang member or illegal alien. But isn't due process and the court system, isn't that for American citizens, or is it open to foreigners?
Well, it's open to everybody, and that's why the term is due process. What process is due you? If you're a citizen, every process is due you. Trial by jury, right to counsel. If you're a green card holder, you have some process that's due to you, but not as much. If you're a visa holder, you have hardly any process that's due. And if you're illegal, then you have no process that's due. All they have to do is give you an opportunity to present your papers. And if you can't, you're out. So the amount of process that is due you will depend on your status and on what claims the government is making about you. If the government is saying, we're deporting you because you're a gang member, then the burden of proof is on the government to prove that he's a gang member. But if they're saying we're deporting you because you're not here legally, then the burden is on the person to prove that he is here legally. So due process is a variable term depending on the status of the person.
Okay. Just going back to your thought, if President Trump wanted to, he could say to President Bukele of El Salvador, hey, you want to have a good relationship with the United States, you need to return this guy. I don't think he cares. He's been very vocal about getting these gang members out of the United States. I don't think this is a favor he's going to call in. Your thoughts on that?
With you, and but the Supreme Court may tell him he has to.
Okay.
The court decision was very vague. It was 9-0, but 3 liberal members of the court basically said, we really do think that the trial court was right. And so we'll get back to the Supreme Court, and we'll have to wait and see what the 2 judges that will decide the outcome of the case, because it might be 5-4, 6-3. If they mandate that he has to be brought back, then I think the president will call in that favor. If he doesn't mandate it, and right now the wording is ambiguous, he has to facilitate it, but it's not clear what that means exactly. And there's no time deadline under the Supreme Court decision. So I think this is a work in progress, and we'll know in the next couple of weeks probably whether there is a clash between the Supreme Court and the President of the United States.
Okay. You set a goal to write a certain number of books by a certain age, you're 86, you continue to pump out more content than most young people in our country. You've got a new book that's coming out, The Preventative State. Tell me what that book is about.
Well, this is my fifth book in 2 years. I really got going after October 7th. Particularly, I wrote a whole bunch of books. This is a book that's been in the works for quite some time. It's a serious book about a movement that has hardly been noticed in this country, although it's becoming more prominent now, and that we're acting more preventively rather than reactively. For example, deportation. That's preventive. We're trying to stop gang members and people who are here illegally from raping and murdering and doing terrible, terrible things. So we're acting preemptively. And, the question I ask in the book is, what if we knew that there was a terrorist attack plan and we didn't know exactly where it was, and we captured one of the people, but there was a whole gang of people? What would we be prepared to do to prevent the terrorist act from occurring? Preventively detaining him? Would we be prepared to apply extreme measures, including torture, if it was required to stop the imminent death of 1,000 people or 10,000 people? It's those kinds of questions that I ask in the book, and I suggest the jurisprudence about how we can answer these questions. And so it's a book I've been thinking about for a long time, and it finally came to fruition now, and it's on Amazon. You can get an advance order. And I think a lot of people find it interesting because it deals not only with preventive law, but preventive medicine, preventive environmental issues, a whole range of how we're moving toward prevention, because two phenomena are occurring at the same time. Number one, the dangers of cataclysmic nuclear and medical and other things are greater than ever before. And our ability to predict is greater than ever before. So we can do more to prevent it. Can we do it without intruding on liberty? That's why the subtitle of the book is The Challenge of Preventing Serious Harms While Preserving Essential Liberties. And that's what I try to address in the book.
Okay. Just for the layman, including myself, I'm extremely lay. You speak of jurisprudence as the mechanism. What do you mean by that? And then how do we use that to find a balance in keeping our liberties and also our safety?
What a great question. And it's a question that everybody should be asking, whether you're a lay person or a professional. We have, from the beginning of our history, had to decide how to strike that balance. We did it in the First Amendment by striking it in favor of free speech. We did it in the Fifth Amendment. We did it all through our history. And that's what a jurisprudence is. A jurisprudence is the rule of law. After debate and after conversations and after legislation and after judicial rulings, we finally come down with, for example, the very famous statement, better 10 guilty go free than one innocent be wrongly convicted. That's a jurisprudence. That says we're going to err on the side of allowing guilty people to go free rather than convict innocent people, particularly in sentencing them to either death or long-term commitment. And it took us a long time throughout history to come to that number, 10 to 1. Actually comes from the Bible, from the book of Genesis. But we have to do that for everything. How many mentally ill people do we want to lock up in order to prevent somebody from setting fire to the home of Josh Shapiro? The guy was obviously a mental case. If we could have anticipated him in advance, could we lock him up, even though we hadn't done anything yet? Those are the kinds of questions that I pose in this book.
Okay, interesting. I think Steven Spielberg did a whole movie about this, The Minority Report. If somebody thinks about murder, is it going towards murder? And should we stop it at the thought versus wait till the action happens?
Well, I actually wrote an article 10 years before Minority Report, in which I laid out that issue very clearly. And so I was invited, when Minority Report came out, I was invited to go and see an early version of it. And I know one of the writers from it. So yeah, I influenced Minority Report, and it influenced me, and we were both influenced by science fiction writers.
Interesting. Okay. I didn't know that. Okay. Final question. I appreciate you coming on. My wife and I, we were watching this documentary on O.J. Simpson. and I see this team of lawyers walking. I see this younger lawyer with brown curly hair, and I realize it's you, Alan Dershowitz. I say, hey, I've interviewed this guy several times. In light of the Luigi Mangione case that's going, is in the public right now, where he allegedly assassinates the CEO of United Healthcare, as a lawyer, do you want to know definitively whether your client is guilty of murder or not? Or do you want to remain vague so that you can give them the very best counsel and representation?
I must know everything about the case. I have to know more than the judge, more than the jury, sometimes even more than the defendant. So I don't want to be kept in the dark about anything. Now, I can't reveal what I've been told, but I have to know. And by the way, I don't ask the defendant because he'll just lie to me, and I don't want to start my relationship. Every client says, I'm innocent. How can anybody think I was guilty? So I don't ask that question. What I ask is the following question. If the worst case scenario, if all your best friends came in and testified against you, what would they be saying? What's the best case that they could make against you? And then I get them to tell me that, and then gradually we get to everything that's in the case. And look, I've had, 300 cases in my life, and I've been fortunate to win many, many, many of them. And many have been guilty and many have been not guilty. And I defend the guilty as zealously as the innocent. And most people over my career have been guilty. Why? Thank God for that. Would you want to live in a country where most people who are charged with crime are innocent? That's Iran, that's China, that's Russia. It's not the United States. The majority of people who are charged in this country are guilty. Now, there's this fascinating case that's now going on. In addition to the Mangione case, the case involving this young black man who's stabbed to death through the heart, this young white athlete. And, so many in the black community are gathering around this guy. Imagine if the racial components were shifted. Imagine if it was a white guy who pulled a knife on an unarmed black guy and killed him. Everything would be switched. So we live in a society where race is more important than justice, where almost nobody is interested in abstract, neutral, objective justice. It depends whose ox is being gored and who's been stabbed, who's been killed, and who did it. So race is so dominant still, tragically, in this country about everything involving the administration of justice.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. I just started reading about that case where he's out. They've now raised almost $500,000. His family's moving into a nicer house. I'm like, wait a minute. How do you stab someone that dies and come out of it ahead? So they'll still have to go through all of their due process and all of that.
The jury, everything will turn on the jury. You get a jury that's dominantly of one race rather than the other, it's going to have a different outcome. And so racial justice is alive and well, tragically, in this country. The Bible instructs judges and prosecutors not to recognize faces. In Hebrew, lo takir panim, do not recognize faces. You have to have the mask over your eyes. Everybody recognize faces. If not faces, races. If not races, genders. Everything today in the justice system depends on who you are and not what you've done.
Interesting. Wow. All right. Well, I love it. You always fill this 30 minutes with wisdom. I'm going to put direct links to your new book down below. Alan, thank you so much for coming on. I hope it's a big success like the others have been. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Likewise to you. Thank you.
Thank you.